She's just a disappointment, honestly. We don't talk about her much. She couldn't handle real responsibility, so she does some sort of entry-level service job. Nothing impressive. My mother's voice carried across the private aviation terminal lounge with that particular tone of dismissive shame I'd heard my entire life. She was speaking to someone I couldn't see yet, her words cutting through the quiet luxury of the exclusive space like a knife. I stood frozen near the crew entrance in my crisp pilot's uniform, my captain's stripes clearly visible on my shoulders, holding my flight bag and tablet as I prepared to conduct my pre-flight briefing. The irony of the moment was so thick I could taste it. My name is Jordan Ellis, and I'm 34 years old. I'm a captain for Elite Aviation Services, flying private jets for high-net-worth individuals and corporate clients all over the world. I make over $400,000 a year. I've logged over 8,000 flight hours, and I'm one of the youngest captains in the company's fleet. By any objective measure, I'm successful, accomplished, and living a life most people only dream about. But to my parents, Patricia and Robert Ellis, I'm a failure, a disappointment, an embarrassment they don't talk about at family gatherings or mention to their wealthy friends and business associates. And I was about to discover just how far they'd go to maintain that narrative, even when reality was staring them directly in the face. To understand how we got to this moment, I need to take you back to the beginning of my story and explain exactly how my relationship with my parents became so fractured and toxic. I grew up in Westchester County, New York, in a world of extreme wealth and privilege. My parents ran Ellis & Associates, a boutique wealth management firm that catered exclusively to ultra-high net worth clients, billionaires, celebrities, old money families, successful entrepreneurs. They managed billions of dollars in assets, charged premium fees, and moved in circles where a small account meant someone only had $50 million to invest. Our house was a mansion in an exclusive gated community. I attended the most prestigious private schools where tuition cost more than most people's annual salary. We took exotic vacations to private islands and stayed at 5-star resorts. My parents drove luxury cars that cost more than houses. We had household staff, a chef, housekeepers, gardeners, a driver. Money was never discussed because money was simply always there, abundant and endless. But wealth came with expectations. Very specific, very rigid expectations about what success looked like and what path I was supposed to follow to achieve it. My parents had my entire life mapped out before I was old enough to have opinions of my own. Prestigious university, advanced degree in business or finance, position at a major investment bank or consulting firm, eventually joining their wealth management company to take over the family business. My older brother Marcus followed this script perfectly. He went to Wharton, got his MBA from Harvard, worked at Goldman Sachs for 5 years, then joined Ellis & Associates, where he was being groomed to eventually take over when my parents retired. He married appropriately. His wife Victoria came from old money and had impeccable social connections. They lived in a penthouse in Manhattan, had 2 perfect children, and represented everything my parents valued. Conventional success, impressive credentials, wealth, status, connections. I was supposed to be the same. But from an early age, I knew I wanted something completely different. I'd always been fascinated by aviation. When I was 7 years old, my parents took us on a trip to Europe, and I spent the entire transatlantic flight in awe of the pilots, imagining what it would be like to control something so powerful and complex, to navigate through the sky, to have that level of skill and responsibility. I started reading everything I could about planes and flying, watching documentaries, building model aircraft, dreaming about becoming a pilot someday. My parents thought it was a cute childhood phase that I'd outgrow. When I was 10 and still obsessed with aviation, they started getting concerned. When I was 13 and asking about flight schools and pilot training, they became dismissive and frustrated. When I was 16 and announced that I wanted to pursue aviation as a career, they were horrified and adamantly opposed. Flying is not a career for someone of your background and potential, my father had said firmly, his tone making it clear this wasn't up for discussion. It's a blue-collar trade. You're meant for something far more significant and impressive than being a glorified bus driver in the sky. But you manage money for people who own private jets, I'd protested. You think aviation is impressive enough for your clients but not for your own daughter? Our clients are successful business people who can afford to charter planes. my mother had explained with exaggerated patience as if speaking to a slow child. The pilots who fly those planes are service workers, Jordan. They're employees. They're not owners or entrepreneurs or leaders. They're skilled laborers who take orders and fly where they're told. Is that really what you aspire to? Taking orders from people more successful than you? I'd argued, of course. I'd fought back against their narrow definition of success and their rigid expectations. But they held all the power, the money, the access, the control over my future. They made it crystal clear that if I pursued aviation, I'd be doing it without their financial support or approval. So I made a choice. I went to NYU as they wanted, not because I cared about business school, but because it kept the peace and gave me access to resources I needed. But I also secretly enrolled in flight school, working multiple part-time jobs to pay for flight training that cost tens of thousands of dollars. I spent my supposed study time at the airport instead of the library, accumulating flight hours while my parents thought I was building an impressive academic resume. By the time I graduated from NYU with a degree in business that I had zero interest in, I'd also earned my private pilot license, my instrument rating, my commercial license, and my multi-engine rating. I'd logged over 300 flight hours. I'd positioned myself to actually pursue the career I wanted, not the one my parents had scripted for me. The confrontation after graduation was explosive and devastating. My parents had expected me to go to business school or take a position at a prestigious firm. Instead, I told them I'd been accepted into a regional airlines pilot training program and would be moving to Texas to begin my career as a first officer. My mother had actually cried, not tears of sadness or worry, but tears of rage and humiliation. "How could you do this to us?" she demanded. "How could you throw away every advantage and opportunity we've given you? Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? What are we supposed to tell people when they ask what you're doing with your life?" "You could tell them I'm following my dreams and doing what makes me happy," I'd suggested, already knowing that would never be acceptable to them. My father had been colder and more calculated in his response. "If you choose this path, you choose it without us," he'd said flatly. "We won't financially support a decision this foolish and short-sighted. You'll be on your own entirely. And don't expect us to pretend we approve or to include you in family business or social events where you'd be an embarrassment." I'd accepted those terms, painful as they were. I moved to Texas with 2 suitcases, a few $1,000s I'd saved from my various jobs, and a determination to prove I could build a successful life on my own terms, even without their approval or support. The next decade was challenging, but ultimately rewarding beyond anything I could have imagined. I worked as a first officer for a regional airline, living in a tiny apartment with roommates, surviving on a modest salary while I built flight hours and experience. I flew constantly. Early mornings, late nights, weekends, holidays, whatever schedule they gave me. I logged thousands of hours flying turboprops on short regional routes, dealing with difficult weather and challenging airports, becoming an exceptional pilot through sheer repetition and dedication. After 3 years, I upgraded to captain at the regional airline. After 2 more years, I was hired by a major legacy carrier as a first officer flying narrow-body jets on domestic routes. My salary increased substantially, and I was able to move into my own apartment and start living more comfortably. After another 3 years of building hours and seniority, I upgraded to captain on wide-body international aircraft, flying 777s and 787s to Europe and Asia and making well over $200,000 annually. But I wanted something more. I loved flying, but the airline schedule was grueling and impersonal. I wanted to fly more sophisticated aircraft with more autonomy and better quality of life. So when I heard that Elite Aviation Services, one of the most prestigious private jet operators in the country, was hiring experienced captains for their ultra-long-range fleet, I applied immediately. The interview process was rigorous and highly selective. They wanted captains with substantial flight experience, impeccable records, professional polish, and the ability to interact seamlessly with extremely wealthy and demanding clients. Out of over 500 applicants, they hired only 12 new captains that year. I was one of them. For the past 4 years, I'd been flying Gulfstream G650s and Bombardier Global 7500s for Elite Aviation Services, literally the most advanced and luxurious private jets available. My typical clients were CEOs, celebrities, politicians, wealthy families, anyone who could afford to pay $20,000 per flight hour for the ultimate in private aviation. I flew them to exotic destinations around the world, often staying in incredible hotels in amazing cities while they conducted their business or enjoyed their vacations. The job was extraordinary. The aircraft were technological marvels, a pure joy to fly. The pay was exceptional. My base salary was $300,000, plus substantial per diem allowances. And with the amount I flew, I typically earned over $400,000 annually. I had a luxurious apartment in Manhattan with stunning views. I'd paid off all my debts, including my substantial flight training loans. I had a healthy investment portfolio. I was living an incredible life by any objective measure, but my parents still saw me as a failure and disappointment. In the 12 years since I'd chosen aviation over their preferred path, our relationship had been virtually non-existent. They'd invited me to exactly 3 family events. Marcus, who lives in New York, without mentioning what I did, and my grandmother's funeral, where they told relatives I worked in transportation to avoid having to say I was a pilot. They never called to check on me or ask about my life. They never acknowledged my promotions or achievements. When I'd made captain at the major airline, a significant milestone that represented years of hard work and dedication, I'd called to share the news, and my mother had said, "That's nice, dear," with the same tone you'd use to acknowledge someone mentioning they'd gotten a haircut. Marcus maintained some contact with me, though it was strained by our parents' disapproval. He'd occasionally meet me for dinner when I was between flights, and he'd expressed genuine pride in my accomplishments, even if he didn't fully understand my career. But he was also careful not to advocate too strongly for me to our parents, because he didn't want to risk his own position in the family business and their good graces. I'd made peace with this situation, or so I thought. I'd built a life I loved without their support or approval. I had friends, relationships, adventures, financial security, professional satisfaction. I didn't need them to validate my choices. Their judgment couldn't hurt me anymore because I'd proven to myself that I'd made the right decision. Or, at least that's what I told myself, until the moment I heard my mother dismissing me as a disappointment to someone in the private aviation terminal, not knowing I was standing right there in my captain's uniform about to fly the very jet they were about to board. I'd been assigned a flight that morning from Teterboro Airport, in New Jersey to Los Angeles, a routine cross-country trip in one of our newest G650s. The passengers were listed as Robert and Patricia Ellis plus guest, but that's not unusual. Many of our clients have common names, and I hadn't made the connection to my parents. Why would I? They would never charter a private jet through a company where their disappointing daughter worked. They'd made it clear they wanted nothing to do with my aviation career, but apparently they hadn't made the connection either when booking through their usual charter broker. And now here we were, about to have the most awkward and revealing family reunion imaginable. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and walked into the main lounge area where passengers waited before boarding. And there they were, my mother in an expensive designer suit, and my father in custom-tailored business attire, looking every bit the successful wealth management executives they were. And with them was a man I recognized from business news coverage, David Chen, the billionaire founder and CEO of Chen Technologies, one of the largest and most successful tech companies in the world. My parents were clearly trying to impress him, laughing at something he'd said, my mother touching his arm in that calculated way she did when networking with important people. This was obviously a business development meeting. They were probably trying to convince him to move his substantial assets to their wealth management firm. And my mother had just told this potential billion-dollar client that her daughter was a disappointment, who did some entry-level service job, not knowing that her daughter was about to walk over in a captain's uniform to introduce herself as their pilot for the next 6 hours. The moment was so perfectly, ironically beautiful that I had to suppress a smile. After 12 years of judgment and dismissal, after being written off as a failure, after being excluded and minimized and treated as an embarrassment, I was about to shatter their carefully constructed narrative in the most public and undeniable way possible. I walked directly toward them, my footsteps confident on the polished floor, my uniform immaculate and professional, my captain's stripes gleaming under the lounge's elegant lighting. David Chen saw me first, his expression shifting from polite conversation to attentive interest as he registered my uniform and rank. My father noticed me next, his eyes widening in shock and confusion. My mother was mid-sentence, still talking about something related to their wealth management services, when she finally followed their gazes and saw me standing there. The color drained from her face. Her mouth literally fell open. My father looked like he'd been struck by lightning. The champagne glass in my mother's hand trembled visibly. "Good morning," I said with calm professionalism, making direct eye contact with David Chen first as protocol required. "I'm Captain Jordan Ellis, and I'll be flying your aircraft to Los Angeles this morning. I just wanted to introduce myself before we begin boarding and go over the flight plan with you if you have any questions." David Chen stood immediately, extending his hand with a warm smile that suggested genuine respect. "Captain Ellis, it's a pleasure," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "I've flown with elite aviation many times, and I'm always impressed with your pilot's professionalism and skill." "Thank you, sir," I replied, returning his smile. "We take great pride in providing the highest level of service and safety. Our flight time today will be approximately 5 hours and 45 minutes, and weather looks excellent across the entire route. We'll be cruising at 45,000 feet where you'll have smooth conditions and excellent visibility." My parents were still frozen in place, staring at me with expressions that cycled rapidly through shock, confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror as they processed what they were seeing. I turned to them with the same professional courtesy I'd show any passenger. "Good morning," I said neutrally, as if we were strangers. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Captain Ellis. Will you be joining Mr. Chen on this flight?" My mother made a small strangled sound. My father opened his mouth, but no words came out. David Chen looked between us with obvious confusion, clearly sensing something strange in the dynamic. "Wait," David said slowly, his sharp businessman's mind piecing together the obvious connection. "Ellis, are you related to Robert and Patricia?" Before I could answer, my mother found her voice, though it came out higher and thinner than normal. "I'm their daughter," I said calmly, deciding that honesty was the cleanest path forward. "I've been a commercial pilot for 12 years and a captain with elite aviation for the past 4 years. Small world, isn't it?" The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. David Chen's eyes widened as he processed this information and clearly remembered the conversation he'd just been having with my parents about their disappointing daughter who worked an entry-level service job. His gaze shifted to my captain's stripes, then to my parents' horrified faces, then back to me. "Your daughter is a captain?" David said, and I could hear the wheels turning in his mind. "For elite aviation. Flying." He gestured around at the luxurious terminal and the G650 visible through the windows. "Aircraft like this?" "Yes, sir," I confirmed. "I primarily fly the G650 and Global 7500. I have about 8,000 total flight hours, and I've been flying private jets for the past 4 years after spending 8 years with commercial airlines." David Chen started laughing. Not cruel laughter, but genuine amusement at the absurdity of the situation. "So let me get this straight," he said, looking at my parents. "You just told me your daughter was a disappointment who couldn't handle real responsibility and worked some entry-level service job. But she's actually a captain flying multi-million-dollar jets for one of the most elite aviation companies in the world." My parents looked like they wanted the floor to open up and swallow them whole. My mother's face had gone from pale to bright red. My father's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching. "We didn't know," my father started. "You didn't know your own daughter's career?" David interrupted, his tone sharp now. "You didn't know she's literally at the top of her profession? Do you have any idea how difficult it is to become a captain, especially on aircraft like this? Do you understand the skill and dedication and intelligence required?" I remained silent, letting this incredibly wealthy and influential man, their potential client, make exactly the points I would have loved to make for 12 years, but they'd never listened to. "Patricia." "Robert," David continued, shaking his head in disbelief. "I've been in business for 30 years and I've flown on hundreds of private jets. I can tell you without hesitation that the pilots who fly these aircraft are among the most competent and professional people I've ever encountered. They're making split-second decisions that literally keep us alive. They're managing incredibly complex systems and navigating challenging conditions and taking responsibility for multi-million-dollar aircraft and their passengers' safety. That's not entry-level anything. That's elite-level expertise." My mother tried to speak, but David wasn't finished. "And beyond the technical competence, do you know what I pay for these flights? $20,000 to $25,000 per hour. You manage wealth, So let me put this in terms you'll understand. The captain flying us today probably makes $300,000 to $400,000 a year, gets to travel the world, operates cutting-edge technology, and has a skill set that's incredibly rare and valuable. That sounds like success to me. He turned to me with an expression that was both apologetic and respectful. Captain Ellis, I apologize if I'm overstepping, but I'm genuinely baffled by what I'm hearing. Your parents just spent the last 15 minutes telling me about their son Marcus, who works for their wealth management firm, clearly very proud of him. But they described you as a disappointment. I'm trying to understand their logic. I appreciated David Chen's directness, but I also needed to maintain my professional composure. This was still a client flight, and I couldn't let family drama interfere with my responsibilities. Mr. Chen, I said diplomatically, I appreciate your kind words about my profession. My parents and I have different perspectives on career success, and that's okay. What's important right now is getting you safely and comfortably to Los Angeles. If you're ready to board, I'd like to get started with our pre-flight procedures. But David Chen wasn't ready to let this go. He looked at my parents with an expression that had shifted from amused disbelief to something colder and more judgmental. You know, he said, his tone harder now, one of the things I value most in the people I do business with is their judgment and their values. How you treat people, especially your own family, tells me a lot about your character and integrity. He paused, letting that sink in. My mother's face had gone pale again. My father was staring at the floor. I've been considering moving my assets to Ellis & Associates, David continued. That's why I agreed to this meeting and this trip. But I'm having serious doubts now about whether you're the kind of people I want managing my wealth. Mr. Chen, please, my father said desperately. This is a personal family matter that doesn't reflect on our professional capabilities or business practices. Doesn't it, though? David challenged. You're supposed to be experts in recognizing value and making smart assessments, but you completely failed to recognize the value and success of your own daughter. You dismissed her impressive career as an entry-level service job. What does that say about your judgment? What else might you be wrong about? My mother looked like she might cry or faint or both. This was clearly spiraling into a disaster for them. And while part of me felt vindicated after years of their judgment and dismissal, another part of me, the professional part, knew I needed to redirect this situation before it became an even bigger scene. Mr. Chen, I said respectfully but firmly, I really do need to ask everyone to board so we can depart on schedule. I understand there's some personal tension here, but I promise you'll receive the excellent service Elite Aviation is known for, regardless of any family dynamics. David looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're absolutely right, Captain, and your professionalism in this awkward situation is noted and appreciated. Let's board. I led them out of the lounge toward the aircraft, walking slightly ahead as protocol required. Behind me, I could hear my mother trying to salvage the situation with David Chen, her voice strained and desperate. David, please understand. We had no idea she was doing so well, my mother said, which was such an absurd statement it almost made me laugh. We haven't been in close contact with Jordan for several years. If we'd known she'd become a captain. You haven't been in contact with your own daughter for years? David interrupted, his tone making clear he found this even more damning than her previous statements. That tells me everything I need to know about your priorities and values. We reached the aircraft stairs where my first officer, Nicole Martinez, was waiting to greet the passengers. Nicole was an excellent pilot I'd flown with many times, and she could clearly sense tension in the group, but maintained her professional smile. Good morning, everyone, Nicole said warmly. Welcome aboard. If you'll follow me, I'll show you to your seats and get you settled while Captain Ellis completes the pre-flight. I stayed outside to conduct my exterior walk-around inspection, while Nicole got the passengers situated. This was partly protocol. The captain always does a thorough exterior inspection before every flight. But I was also grateful for a few minutes away from the intense awkwardness of the situation to collect my thoughts. The G650 was beautiful as always, sleek and powerful, representing the pinnacle of private aviation technology. I ran my hands along the fuselage as I checked for any damage or irregularities, finding comfort in the familiar routine. This aircraft, this career, this life I'd built, this was real and solid and valuable, regardless of what my parents thought or said. After completing my inspection, I climbed the stairs and entered the aircraft. The cabin was configured in a standard luxury layout with large leather seats, polished wood trim, state-of-the-art entertainment systems, and every amenity imaginable. David Chen had taken a seat in the main cabin. My parents were sitting together across the aisle from him, both looking miserable and uncomfortable. Nicole met me near the cockpit door. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly, clearly picking up on the weird energy. "Complicated family situation," I said briefly. "But we'll handle it professionally as always." She nodded understanding and went to conduct the safety briefing while I entered the cockpit and began my pre-flight procedures. This was my sanctuary, my domain, the place where everything made sense and my competence was undeniable. I ran through checklists methodically, contacted ground control, programmed the flight management system, reviewed weather and NOTAMs, prepared the aircraft for flight with the precision and care I'd demonstrated thousands of times before. Nicole joined me after securing the cabin, and we completed our pre-flight procedures together, running through checklists and briefings with practiced efficiency. 20 minutes later, we were taxiing to the runway. The powerful Rolls-Royce engine spooling up with that distinctive high-pitched whine that still gave me a thrill even after thousands of flights. Elite 37 Alpha, cleared for takeoff runway 19, tower position and hold short of taxiway Alpha. The controller said in my headset, "Cleared for takeoff 19. Position and hold taxiway Alpha, Elite 37 Alpha," I confirmed. Guiding the aircraft into position on the runway centerline, Elite 37 Alpha. "Tower, wind 190 at 8. Cleared for takeoff. Cleared for takeoff. Elite 37 Alpha," I responded, advancing the throttles smoothly forward. The G650 accelerated down the runway with impressive power, pushing us back in our seats. "V1," Nicole called out as we passed the first critical speed. "Rotate," she announced at the precise moment, and I pulled back smoothly on the yoke, lifting the nose into the air. The aircraft climbed eagerly into the clear morning sky, leaving the ground behind as we transitioned into my element, my domain, the place where I was completely in control. As we climbed through 10,000 feet and Nicole raised the landing gear, I felt that familiar sense of peace and accomplishment that flying always brought me. Up here, none of the family drama mattered. Up here, there was only flying, the technical precision, the beauty of flight, the responsibility and skill that defined my career and my life. We leveled off at our cruise altitude of 45,000 feet about 30 minutes into the flight. At this altitude, the sky was incredibly clear, the horizon curved visibly, and you could see for hundreds of miles in every direction. The aircraft hummed along smoothly at Mach 085, eating up the miles between New York and Los Angeles with impressive efficiency. Once we were established in cruise and the workload decreased, I made an announcement to the cabin as was standard procedure. "Good morning from the flight deck," I said over the intercom, my voice calm and professional. "We're currently cruising at 45,000 feet. Our ground speed is 540 knots, and we're showing an arrival time in Los Angeles of approximately 12:30 local time. Weather at destination is clear and 72 degrees. We'll be descending in about 4 hours, and I'll update you at that time. If you need anything during the flight, please don't hesitate to let us know." About an hour into the flight, Nicole volunteered to go check on the passengers and see if they needed anything. This was standard service. Unlike commercial flights, private jet travel involved much more personal attention and accommodation. She returned to the cockpit a few minutes later with an interesting expression on her face. "So," she said carefully as she settled back into her seat, "want to tell me what's actually going on back there? Because the tension is thick enough to cut with a knife. Those passengers are my parents," I explained briefly. "We haven't spoken in about 12 years because they disapproved of my career choice. They've been telling people I'm a failure and disappointment. They had no idea I'd become a captain or that I'd be flying them today." Nicole's eyes widened. "Oh my God," she said. "That's incredibly awkward. How are they handling it?" "Not well," I said with slight amusement. "The other passenger, David Chen, is apparently a potential client they were trying to land for their wealth management business. He overheard my mother calling me a disappointment right before I introduced myself as their captain. He's not impressed with them." Nicole actually laughed at that. "Karma is real," she said. "That's the most perfect timing I've ever heard." We flew in companionable silence for a while, both of us monitoring instruments and systems with practiced attention. Private aviation required constant vigilance even though most of the flight was handled by sophisticated autopilot systems. We were ultimately responsible for the safety of everyone aboard, and the multi-million-dollar aircraft we were operating. About 2 hours into the flight, my intercom panel lit up indicating someone in the cabin wanted to speak to the cockpit. I picked up the handset. "Flight deck, this is Captain Ellis." "Captain, this is David Chen," came the voice through the phone. "I was wondering if I might come up to the cockpit and talk with you for a few minutes. I'm a licensed pilot myself, though I only fly recreationally, and I'd love to see the G650's flight deck if you're comfortable with that." I glanced at Nicole, who nodded her approval. "Of course, Mr. Chen," I replied. "Come on up whenever you'd like." A minute later, there was a knock on the cockpit door, and I verified through the security camera before unlocking it. David Chen entered the flight deck, and I could see genuine enthusiasm and interest on his face as he took in the sophisticated avionics and displays. This wasn't someone just making small talk. This was a fellow aviation enthusiast who appreciated what he was seeing. "This is incredible," David said, his eyes scanning the large digital displays. "I fly a Cirrus SR-22, so this is several orders of magnitude more sophisticated than what I'm used to seeing. It's an amazing aircraft," I agreed. "State-of-the-art in every way. These displays give us unprecedented situational awareness, and the automation is incredibly advanced, while still keeping us actively engaged in the flying." David took the jump seat behind us where visiting pilots or company personnel typically sat. "May I ask you something personal?" he said after a moment. "Of course," I replied, though I had a good idea where this was going. "How did you end up estranged from your parents over becoming a pilot?" he asked directly. I'm trying to understand their perspective, but honestly, I'm having trouble seeing how anyone could view this career as a failure or disappointment. I took a breath, organizing my thoughts. My parents run a wealth management firm for ultra-high net worth clients, I explained. Their entire world revolves around conventional markers of success: prestigious degrees, high-status careers, wealth accumulation, social connections. My brother Marcus followed their script perfectly. Wharton, Harvard MBA, Goldman Sachs, then joining the family firm. "He's exactly what they wanted, and you weren't?" David prompted. "I wanted to fly," I said simply. From the time I was a child, aviation was my passion. But my parents viewed piloting as a blue-collar trade job beneath someone of my background and education and potential. They wanted me to go to business school and work in finance. When I chose aviation instead, they essentially disowned me, said I was a disappointment and an embarrassment, cut off financial support, and told me not to expect to be included in family events where I'd reflect poorly on them. David was silent for a moment, processing this. "And they genuinely had no idea you'd become a captain? That you were this successful in your chosen field?" "They never asked," I said with a shrug. "We haven't had a real conversation in 12 years. Occasionally I'd see them at major family events, my brother's wedding, my grandmother's funeral, but they'd introduce me vaguely as working in transportation or having a job in New York, without ever acknowledging what I actually do. They wrote me off as a failure 12 years ago and never revisited that conclusion even as I progressed in my career. That's remarkably closed-minded for people who are supposed to be sophisticated. Enough to manage billions in assets," David observed. "I mean, you're clearly intelligent, competent, successful by any objective measure. What would it have taken for them to see that?" "Probably exactly what happened this morning," I said honestly. "Having their narrative challenged by someone whose opinion they actually care about. They don't value my assessment of my own life or career. But you, Mr. Chen, you're a billionaire, a potential client, someone they want to impress. When you called out their judgment and questioned their values based on how they've treated me, that actually penetrated in a way my own words never could have." David nodded slowly. "I meant what I said back in the terminal," he told me. "How people treat their family, especially when they think no one important is watching, tells you everything about their true character. Your parents treated you with dismissal and contempt for years. That's not the kind of people I want making decisions about my wealth." "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. "Though I should mention that I don't actually know if they're good or bad at wealth management. Their judgment of me was certainly flawed, but that doesn't necessarily reflect on their financial expertise." "Perhaps," David acknowledged. "But judgment is judgment. If they can be this wrong about something they should know intimately, their own daughter's life and career, what else might they be wrong about? Why would I trust their judgment about complex financial decisions? It was a fair point, though I felt slightly guilty that my family drama was apparently costing my parents a major client. Then again, they'd created this situation through their own behavior and attitudes. I was just the catalyst revealing what was already there. "Can I ask you something else?" David said. "Do you regret your choice? Knowing it cost you your relationship with your parents, would you make the same decision again?" Without hesitation, I replied immediately. "This career, this life, I love it. Every day I get to do something that's challenging and meaningful and beautiful. I get to travel the world, operate incredible machines, take responsibility for people's safety, continually learn and improve my skills. The financial compensation is excellent, but even if it wasn't, I'd still choose this over sitting in an office managing spreadsheets or trying to convince wealthy people to move their money to our firm." I paused, glancing at the instruments before continuing. My parents' approval would have been nice. I wish our relationship hadn't become so damaged, but I can't build my life around their narrow expectations and definitions of success. I had to choose authenticity over approval, passion over prestige, and I've never regretted that choice, even in the hardest moments. "Good for you," David said with genuine respect. "Too many people live their entire lives trying to meet their parents' expectations or society's standards, never figuring out what they actually want or value. You figured it out young and had the courage to pursue it despite significant pressure to conform. That takes real strength." We talked for another 30 minutes about aviation, about his own flying experiences, about business and career choices and family expectations. He was surprisingly easy to talk to for a billionaire. Intelligent, curious, down to earth in his demeanor despite his enormous wealth and success. Eventually, he returned to the cabin, thanking us for our time and the conversation. After he left, Nicole turned to me with a smile. "Well," she said, "that was one of the more unusual flights we've had. Your parents must be absolutely dying back there." "Probably," I acknowledged. Though honestly, I'm less focused on their discomfort and more focused on flying this aircraft safely to Los Angeles. Everything else is just noise. But it wasn't just noise, not really. As we continued westward across the country, I found myself thinking about the conversation with David Chen, about the choices I'd made and the prices I'd paid, about whether reconciliation with my parents was even possible or desirable after 12 years of estrangement. About 4 hours into the flight, we began our descent into Los Angeles. I made another announcement to the cabin. "Good morning from the flight deck. We're beginning our descent into Los Angeles now. We should be on the ground in approximately 30 minutes. Weather remains excellent with clear skies and light winds. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for arrival." Nicole and I worked through our descent and approach procedures with practiced efficiency, communicating with air traffic control, configuring the aircraft for landing, running checklists, monitoring systems. This was when flying became most demanding. The arrival phase required intense concentration and precise execution. We were cleared for a visual approach to runway 25R at Van Nuys Airport, the primary private jet airport in Los Angeles. I flew the approach manually, feeling the aircraft respond to my inputs as we descended through the clear California sky. The G650 handled beautifully, precise and responsive, a joy to fly, especially in the final moments before touchdown. I executed a smooth landing, the main gear touching down gently on the runway centerline, followed by the nose gear settling onto the pavement. We decelerated smoothly, exited the runway at the designated taxiway, and followed ground control's instructions to our assigned parking position at the FBO. After shutting down the engines and completing our post-flight procedures, Nicole and I both stood and prepared to open the cabin door for our passengers to deplane. This was the moment when professionalism was most important. Regardless of any personal tension or drama, we needed to provide excellent service and leave passengers with a positive impression of their flight experience. I opened the cockpit door and stepped into the cabin. My parents and David Chen were already gathering their belongings, preparing to exit. I stood near the exit door in my standard position, ready to thank them for flying with us and wish them well in Los Angeles. David came forward first, extending his hand with a warm smile. "Captain Ellis, Nicole, thank you for an excellent flight. Smooth, professional, and the conversation was enlightening. I really appreciate everything. Our pleasure, Mr. Chen, I replied, shaking his hand. We're glad you chose elite aviation. He lowered his voice slightly. I meant what I said. He told me quietly. Your parents made a serious error in judgment about you and your career. That's not the kind of thinking I want managing my money. Life's too short to work with people who can't recognize value when it's right in front of them. I appreciate that, I said sincerely. And I hope you have a great time in Los Angeles. My parents came forward next, both of them looking uncomfortable and uncertain. My mother's eyes were red as if she'd been crying. My father's expression was harder to read. Part shame, part defensiveness, part confusion. Jordan, my mother started, her voice strained. We need to talk. I'm working, Mom, I replied professionally but not unkindly. I have responsibilities here and another flight in a few hours. This isn't the time or place, but we had no idea, she tried to continue. That I was successful? I interrupted gently. That I'd become a captain? That I was doing well in the career I chose despite your disapproval. You never asked. In 12 years, you never once asked about my life with genuine interest. You just decided I was a failure and moved on. My father spoke up then, his tone still carrying that edge of defensiveness I remembered from so many arguments. We thought we were doing what was best for you. We thought you were making a mistake that you'd regret. You thought wrong, I said simply. And rather than ever checking in to see if your assumptions were accurate, you just maintained them for over a decade. You told people I was a disappointment without ever knowing what I'd accomplished. You excluded me from family events because you were embarrassed by a career you never bothered to understand. We're sorry, my mother said, tears starting to flow now. We were wrong. We see that now. Can we please talk about this? Can we try to fix our relationship? I looked at them both. These people who'd raised me but had ultimately chosen their own rigid expectations over supporting their daughter. Part of me wanted to say yes, to accept their apology and try to rebuild what had been broken. But another part of me, the part that had survived 12 years of rejection and built a successful life without their approval, was wary and skeptical. I don't know, I said honestly. You apologized after your potential client called out your behavior and judgment. Would you be apologizing if David Chen hadn't been there to witness your comments about me? Or would you have continued dismissing me as a disappointment who works an entry-level service job? The guilty looks on both their faces told me everything I needed to know. They wouldn't have apologized. They probably wouldn't have even mentioned seeing me today. They would have continued believing and spreading their false narrative about my life and career. I think you should go, I said, not unkindly, but firmly. I have work to do. If you genuinely want to try to repair our relationship, that's something we can discuss when I'm not working. But it's going to take more than one apology offered in front of someone you were trying to impress. It's going to take real effort and genuine change on your part. How do we reach you? My father asked. We don't even have your current contact information. I pulled out my phone and opened a new text message, typing in their phone numbers that I still remembered. There, I said as their phones buzzed with incoming texts. That's my number. If you're serious about this, reach out, but understand that rebuilding trust takes time, especially after 12 years of rejection. They nodded, both looking defeated and ashamed, and moved toward the exit stairs. I watched them descend and cross the ramp toward the waiting car that would take them wherever they were staying in Los Angeles. David Chen was already in his own vehicle, and I saw him nod once in my direction before his driver pulled away. After they were gone, Nicole came up beside me. You okay? She asked with genuine concern. Yeah, I said, surprised to find it was true. I'm actually okay. That was intense and awkward, but also kind of liberating. They finally know the truth. They finally see what I've built and accomplished. Whether they choose to actually process that and change their attitudes remains to be seen, but at least the facade is gone. You handled it with incredible professionalism, Nicole said. I'm not sure I could have maintained that level of composure with my parents in that situation. It's because I'm up here, I said, gesturing around the aircraft and the airport. This is my domain. This is where I'm confident and competent and in control. Their opinions don't change the fact that I'm a captain who just flew them 3,000 miles safely and professionally. Reality doesn't care about their judgment. We spent the next hour completing post-flight procedures, coordinating with maintenance about a minor indicator light that needed checking, and preparing for our return flight later that afternoon. Elite Aviation had booked us into a nice hotel near the airport, where we'd rest for a few hours before flying back to New York with different passengers. As I was gathering my flight bag to head to the hotel, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Captain Ellis, this is David Chen. I wanted you to have my direct contact information. I was serious about what I said regarding your parents and their judgment. I won't be moving my assets to Ellis & Associates, but I would like to continue using Elite Aviation for my flights, and I'd be happy to request you as captain when possible. Your professionalism today in an incredibly awkward situation was impressive. Beyond that, I think you're exactly the kind of person I want in my professional network. Someone who had the courage to choose passion over prestige and the competence to excel in their chosen field. If you're ever interested in discussing career opportunities in aerospace or aviation-related ventures, I'd welcome that conversation. Best regards. David, I stared at the message for a long moment, processing what he was saying. A billionaire tech CEO was offering to network with me, potentially open doors to opportunities I hadn't even considered, specifically because he'd been impressed by how I'd handled a difficult family situation while maintaining professional excellence. Nicole looked over my shoulder and read the message. Holy shit, she breathed. That's a serious endorsement from a serious person. You know, he sits on the board of like 3 major aerospace companies, right? I didn't, I admitted, but that's pretty amazing. Over the next few weeks, my life shifted in interesting and unexpected ways. David Chen did indeed request me for several subsequent flights, and during those trips we had fascinating conversations about aviation technology, about potential business ventures, about career paths I hadn't considered. He introduced me virtually to people in the aerospace industry, opened doors to consulting opportunities, and generally proved that his offer of networking had been genuine. My parents did reach out, repeatedly. At first their messages were defensive and self-justifying. They'd thought they were helping me. They'd had my best interests at heart. I'd never told them how well I was doing, so how could they have known? I ignored these messages because they showed they still weren't really understanding the core issue. But gradually their messages changed. My mother sent a long email detailing how she'd been doing research on aviation careers, reading about what it takes to become a captain, learning about the industry I'd chosen. She acknowledged she'd been ignorant and closed-minded. She apologized not just for the incident at the terminal, but for 12 years of dismissal and rejection. My father sent a shorter but more direct message. I was wrong about you and your career. I let my own narrow definition of success blind me to what you were actually accomplishing. I'm proud of you, even though I have no right to be given how I've treated you. If you're willing to give me a chance to be a better father, I'd like to try. Marcus, my brother, called me, and we had a long, honest conversation. He admitted he'd always been envious of my courage to choose my own path, that he'd sometimes felt trapped by the expectations he'd fulfilled, that he wished he'd defended me more to our parents over the years. We agreed to try to rebuild our sibling relationship independently of whatever happened with our parents. About 2 months after the dramatic flight, I agreed to meet my parents for dinner in Manhattan. We met at a quiet restaurant, and for the first time in 12 years we had a real conversation. They asked genuine questions about my career, my life, my experiences. They listened without judgment. They acknowledged the ways they'd failed me and the damage they'd caused. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. 12 years of hurt doesn't heal in one dinner conversation. But it was a start. We agreed to stay in contact, to try to rebuild our relationship slowly and carefully, to see if trust could be restored over time. My mother made an interesting comment toward the end of dinner. You know what the worst part is? She said quietly. We've been telling people for years that you were a disappointment, that you'd made poor choices, that you weren't successful. And we completely believed it. We never questioned our own narrative. When David Chen challenged us in that terminal, it was the first time anyone had ever really called us out on our judgment, and it forced us to actually look at what you'd accomplished, rather than just assuming we knew. Why did it take someone like David Chen to make you question your assumptions? I asked. Why couldn't you have questioned them yourselves, or listened when I tried to tell you I was doing well? Because we're arrogant, my father said bluntly. We've been successful in our careers, and we've surrounded ourselves with people who share our values and definitions of success. We created an echo chamber where everyone agreed with us that prestigious careers in finance and business were the only paths worth respecting. Having someone from outside that bubble, someone even more successful than us, challenge our judgment was a wake-up call we apparently needed. I appreciated their honesty and self-awareness, even if it had come far too late. We continued meeting occasionally over the following months, gradually building something new where our old relationship had been destroyed. It would never be the close, supportive family dynamic I'd wanted as a young person, but it was better than the estrangement and hostility that had defined the previous 12 years. My career continued to thrive and evolve. Through David Chen's connections, I was offered a consulting position with an aerospace company developing next-generation business jets. I could do this work around my flying schedule, and it both paid well and allowed me to contribute to advancing aviation technology. I started speaking at industry events about career paths in aviation and about the importance of following your passion despite external pressure to conform. About 6 months after the incident, I ran into my parents at a charity gala that David Chen had invited me to attend. They were there because it was a high-profile event where wealthy people networked. Exactly the kind of event they'd previously said I'd be an embarrassment to attend. But now I was there as David Chen's guest, wearing a designer gown I could easily afford, moving confidently through rooms full of successful people who respected my accomplishments. I watched my mother's face as she saw me across the room, saw the complicated mix of emotions: pride, regret, sadness for lost years, hope for the future. She came over to me and we spoke briefly. And for the first time, she introduced me to people by saying, "This is my daughter, Jordan. She's a captain for elite aviation and a consultant in aerospace development," with genuine pride in her voice. Later that evening, I overheard her talking to someone I didn't know, another wealthy woman who was apparently asking about her children. "She has 2 children," I heard my mother say. "My son Marcus works with us in our wealth management firm, and my daughter Jordan is an accomplished pilot and aerospace consultant." I'm very proud of both of them. It was such a stark contrast to the conversation I'd overheard in the terminal 6 months earlier. "She's just a disappointment," that I actually felt emotion welling up in my eyes. Not because I needed my mother's approval to validate my success, but because it felt like acknowledgement of a truth that should have been obvious all along. A year after the dramatic flight, my relationship with my parents had evolved into something cautiously positive. We had regular dinners. They attended some of my speaking engagements. They'd even visited me at an air show where I was displaying one of Elite Aviation's aircraft. They'd met some of my colleagues and friends, seen more of the life I'd built, understood more about the industry I'd chosen. But more importantly, I'd come to terms with the fact that their validation wasn't necessary for my happiness or success. I'd built an incredible life doing work I loved, making excellent money, traveling the world, constantly challenged and engaged. I had great friends, meaningful relationships, professional accomplishments I was genuinely proud of. Their approval was nice when it finally came, but it was supplementary rather than essential. One evening over dinner, my father asked me a question that showed how much he'd learned and grown. "Do you ever regret not following the path we wanted for you?" he asked, not because we wanted it, but because it would have been easier or more financially lucrative or whatever. "Never," I replied without hesitation. Even in the hardest moments, when I was working 3 jobs to pay for flight school, when I was barely making ends meet as a regional airline pilot, when you'd cut me off and I felt completely alone, even then, I knew I'd made the right choice. Because I was doing what I loved. I was building towards something that mattered to me, and ultimately that's worth more than any amount of money or approval. My mother reached across the table and took my hand. "I wish we'd understood that earlier," she said softly. "I wish we'd supported your choice from the beginning. We wasted so many years being judgmental and closed-minded when we could have been proud of what you were accomplishing." "You can't change the past," I said gently. "But you can choose how you show up going forward. That's all any of us can do." 2 years after the incident at the private terminal, David Chen offered me a position on the advisory board of an aerospace startup he was investing in. The company was developing electric aircraft technology, and he wanted someone with both piloting expertise and business acumen to help guide their development. The position paid well and would position me perfectly for future leadership opportunities in the rapidly evolving aviation industry. I accepted, seeing it as a natural evolution of my career. I'd spent 15 years becoming an expert pilot, Now I had opportunities to shape the future of aviation in ways I'd never imagined when I first decided to pursue flying against my parents' wishes. At the press conference announcing the advisory board, journalists asked about my background and how I'd gotten involved in aerospace consulting. I mentioned that I was a captain for elite aviation, that I'd spent over 15 years in commercial and private aviation, that I was passionate about advancing aviation technology. One journalist asked, "Did your family support your decision to pursue aviation as a career?" I paused, thinking about how to answer honestly without being cruel or overly revealing. "My family wanted me to pursue a more traditional career path," I said carefully. "They had concerns about my choices initially, but ultimately they came to understand and respect what I'd built. It took time, but we got there." After the press conference, my mother came up to me. She and my father had been in the audience, which was significant given that 2 years earlier they wouldn't have attended any professional event of mine. "Thank you," my mother said quietly. "For what?" I asked. "For being diplomatic about us in that answer," she replied. "You could have told the truth about how we treated you. You could have publicly called out our prejudice and closed-mindedness, but you chose a gracious answer that protected us. We don't deserve that kindness given how we treated you, but we appreciate it. I'm not interested in punishing you," I said honestly. "I'm interested in living my life and doing work that matters. The past is the past. What matters now is the present and future." As I flew home that evening, as a passenger for once, on a commercial flight since I wasn't working, I looked out the window at the lights of cities passing below and reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. I'd chosen passion over prestige 15 years ago, had been rejected and dismissed and called a failure, had built success anyway through determination and skill. And then one random morning, I'd shown up to fly a routine charter flight and discovered my parents were the passengers. Heard them call me a disappointment right before introducing myself as their captain, and watched their entire false narrative collapse in the most public and undeniable way possible. That moment in the terminal had been a turning point, but not because of the vindication or the satisfaction of proving them wrong. It had been a turning point because it finally forced honest confrontation with reality, theirs and mine. They'd been forced to see what I'd actually accomplished, and I'd been forced to acknowledge that I truly didn't need their approval, that my success was real and valuable regardless of their recognition. The relationship we'd rebuilt in the 2 years since wasn't the relationship we'd had before, and it certainly wasn't the relationship I'd dreamed of as a young person desperately wanting parental support and approval. But it was authentic and honest in a way our previous relationship had never been. They saw me clearly now, my accomplishments, my choices, my values. And I saw them clearly too, their prejudices, their narrow thinking, but also their capacity for growth and change when confronted with undeniable truth. Sometimes the universe gives you exactly the experience you need at exactly the right moment. That morning in the private terminal, being called a disappointment right before revealing myself as the captain who would be flying them across the country, that was my moment. It exposed truth, forced reckoning, created space for something new to grow, where something old and toxic had been. I wouldn't have chosen it if given the option. It had been intensely uncomfortable and awkward, but looking back now, I was grateful for it. Sometimes you need dramatic revelation to break through decades of false narratives and defensive denial. My parents thought I was a failure. I proved I wasn't. Not by arguing or defending, but simply by being exactly who I'd worked so hard to become. A captain, an expert, a professional, someone who'd chosen authentically, and built successfully and lived according to her own values despite significant pressure to conform, and that was worth more than any amount of parental approval could ever be.